It's now time for the chamber, and this morning we are looking at tenancy issues, landlord-tenant issues, which are very, very common around this part of the world. But before we get into the discussion with our guest, let's take a look at this story. Right, my guest this morning is Papaya Osu Ankuma. He's a legal practitioner. Good morning.
Good morning.
It's good to have you here.
Good to be here.
Right, so this morning we're talking about tenancy issues. It's not uncommon to hear of unhealthy landlord-tenant relationships. Landlords in Ghana today are being accused of abusing their positions, but are they justified under the law? This is what we want to look at today. So first of all, I'll ask you, what laws do we have that regulate or kind of governs landlord-tenant issues?
Well, the primary legislation that governs the relationship between landlords and tenants is the Rent Act. The Rent Act was passed as far back as 1962, and together with the rent regulations, they formed the legal framework for regulating the relationship between a landlord and a tenant.
Okay, so there is legislation that backs this kind of transactions between landlords and tenants.
Yes,
but are people aware? Do people know that there's, because there are a lot of issues about landlords and tenants, and a lot of times people don't know what to do. It's like they don't know how to get or seek redress. So is it very common? Is the law a common one that people know about?
Well, I think by and large, people are aware that there's some sort of legislation that regulates the relationship. However, as to whether they are familiar with the nuances of the law, that's a different question.
Right.
Almost every landlord or every tenant knows about rent control.
And that's a very popular phrase.
Yes, and knows that whenever there is a dispute or a misunderstanding between the landlord and the tenant,
there's a place for them to go. Right, we'll get into that more about the rent control, but before that, let's go and now look at that story I said about.
Shelter is undeniably a major part of human life, and in that vein, buildings have become a necessity. And for those who do not have the means to build their own houses, tenancy to them is life-saving. And sometimes this necessity drives them to accept deals and make unnecessary compromises. Here in the Osu Township, we meet Maxwell Tete, a tertiary student. The need to be close to his school has made him silent to the ever-changing demands of his landlord.
He said each room will be provided with refrigerator, then television, then some fans. But normally when you come, there'll be no fridge, no television. What you have is only your fan and your lights.
According to him, his landlord has taken out the habit of turning off electricity in the morning and only returning power at night.
There's some kind of disconnections and stuff. So normally in the evening, that's where we have lights. So during the daytime, no lights. The lights goes off. Since it's a connection, they normally take it off during the daytime. Then in the evening, they will connect it back. Then we have our lights on.
In Ghana, the problem with shelter and some of the unhealthy tenant-landlord relationships is not uncommon. In the article Tenancy, a controversial issue in Ghana, an estimated 95% of landlords insist on collecting rent 1 to 3 years in advance. This is contrary to the existing Rent Act of 1963, Act 220, which states that landlords are only legally allowed to collect rent 6 months in advance. The reality on the ground is much different, since citizens are not complying with the law. Is the Rent Control Department doing what it must to educate the public on principles underpinning tenancy?
Okay, so we were on about the issue of rent control. What exactly is the role of rent control?
Well, previously I spoke about the Rent Act. Now, the Rent Act is a law that was passed to replace the Rent Control Ordinance. This was the previous legal regime that regulated landlord-tenant relationship before the Rent Act was passed. Now, under the Rent Control Ordinance, the primary body that was charged with the administration of the Act or of the ordinance was the Rent Control Department. Now, so it is this Rent Control Department that has survived to date, even though the Act has changed. Now, the role of the Rent Control Department is to implement the provisions of the Rent Act in relation to landlords and tenants. This would be assessing rent when...
And is this something they do? Are they efficient in their duties, all what you've just mentioned? Do they have a say in the increment of rent and all of that?
By law, they do.
Do they do it though, in reality?
To a certain extent, they do. But the Rent Control Department comes in only when there's a disagreement between the landlord and tenant. Unfortunately, we don't have a department that is proactive, that is well-resourced to, let's say, go out there and police the implementation of the Act. We have a more reactive department.
So in effect, they are ineffective?
I won't say ineffective, but I say within the constraints that they are working, I think they are doing quite a good job. With the limited resources that they have, they become more reactionary than proactive.
Okay, so if for instance my landlord increase my rent without any notice, can I go to rent control, and what can they do about it? How do they assist me?
Definitely. I mean, by the provisions of the Rent Act, no landlord can increase rent without having recourse first to the tenant who is in the premises. And before the landlord can take any such rent, he has to give notice to the tenant of such an increment. Now, what usually happens is in such a situation would be that the tenant would make a report to the Rent Control Department. The procedure at the Rent Control Department would be to invite the landlord and then sit with the landlord and the tenant, presided over by a rent control officer, and then have discussions as to how to resolve the issue. More often than not, what happens is that the rent officer assesses the rent. Now, when we talk about assessment of rent by an independent party such as the rent control officer, we are talking about the rent control officer having regard to certain things as the rateable value.
Exactly. Now that brings me to my next question. Now, rent in Ghana is freely negotiated. The increases are unrestricted, and so on and so forth. So can for instance, you're talking about the assessment of the rent. Is it the responsibility, or does the rent control have a duty to kind of restrict increment, or is there a certain benchmark or something that they must not pass? Landlords, I mean.
Well, not particularly, as you all know.
So anyone can just give you any rate at all, is what we are saying.
We're in a free economy. And as much as possible.
But isn't this supposed to be one of the duties of the rent control, to kind of regulate increment and all of that?
They do regulate increment, but first the increment has to be negotiated by the landlord and the tenant. It is only when there's a lack of agreement that the rent control officer will step in. You would agree that if a landlord wants to increase rent by 100%, and this sits well with the tenant, there will be no need to engage another person to assess rent. However, it is when the tenant feels that the increment is either unjustified or unreasonable that the a report will be made to rent control.
So in this case, when they step in, can they kind of mitigate, or what happens when they step in?
Yes.
Are they able to prey upon the landlord to reduce it, or what exactly happens?
By law, when they assess rent, the landlord is bound by the new assessment that the rent control officer makes. After an assessment is made, the landlord or any person who is dissatisfied with the assessment may apply to court, I think within a period of time, to seek redress. Okay, so if an assessment is made and no one objects to that assessment, then that becomes the rent that has to be paid
Agreeable.
Between the landlord.
What if the landlord rejects it, which in most cases I'm sure happens?
Well, then if the landlord rejects the assessment or fails to comply with the assessment, then the rent control officer will put the matter before a rent magistrate. This is usually a district court judge. Now, the district court judge will go into the issue, and the district court judge also has power to order a new assessment of rent. However, the difference here is that when it goes to the district court and the rent is finally assessed, now the landlord becomes bound by the new assessment.
Right. Okay, another major problem for most tenants is eviction or wrongful eviction, sometimes even eviction without notice or eviction when you haven't found another place. How does the rent control or the act come in here?
Well, the act generally governs how and when a tenant may be evicted from premises. Now, in the act, it requires the landlord to give notice of such an eviction, and it gives.
How much notice?
It depends. For business premises, you have to give notice up to 6 months. For residential premises, it depends on the type of the tenancy.
Tenancy agreement you sign.
Yes. Okay. If it's a tenancy from month to month, then you are entitled to a month's notice. It goes up to 3 months if it's for a year. So really it depends.
What if after the 3-month period or a month's period where you haven't found a place?
Well, that should not be a consideration for eviction, whether or not you found a place. The only issue should be whether the landlord is properly exercising his right of eviction.
What does that mean?
That means that he has proper cause to terminate the tenancy and evict the tenant, and also whether he has complied with the provisions of the law.
Okay, let's take this example. Basically, your tenancy has come to an end, and maybe you're unable to renew it because, of course, the increment is way too high for you. So you're asking for a grace period to find another place.
Well, typically, by law, when your tenancy expires, you become what you call a statutory tenant. You hold over from your previous term. So what you are liable to do is to pay the same rent as you would have under the
for the number of months that you continue
to occupy the premises. However,
so for that grace period, that 3 months or 1 month or whatever period, you still continue to pay rent. You must pay the rent.
Yes, definitely. You cannot occupy premises without paying rent. Right. The only issue is the quantum of rent that are payable. Now, a statutory tenant is can be evicted by giving him notice like any other tenant, and after the notice is given, if he doesn't comply, you can go to court to seek an eviction order against the tenant. Now, the tenant also has a right to apply for relief against being evicted. Now, because the law regards the primary motive of tenancy agreement as being the payment of rent, right? So that if you want to evict someone from premises and the person is willing and ready to pay whatever rent he is supposed to pay, typically the courts will allow him to remain in the premises and continue to pay rent. It is when the landlord is terminating for another reason which is different from the payment of rent. For instance, the landlord feels that he wants to occupy the premises himself, or he wants to use it for his business and whatnot. When that comes in, then you have considerations other than the payment of rent.
Okay. Right. Now, what is the process? We've talked a lot about the landlords. Let's come to the tenants now. What is the process for evicting a tenant who refuses to pay rent? There are some out there like that. I know a lot of the time we talk about how mean and unreasonable landlords are, but there are some equally very unreasonable tenants. So if someone refuses to pay rent, you can't just go and throw them out, can you?
No.
So what is the process?
The process is to serve notice of your intention to evict.
After how many months?
Now, like we said, for business premises, you serve notice of 6 months.
If they haven't paid rent for what number of months would they have needed not to have paid rent for you to be able to evict them?
Well,
after a month?
Under the Act, the period that they shouldn't have paid rent for is 30 days, which is 1 month. How it works out in practice is that, for instance, let's take the month of September. The rent for the month of September becomes due at the end of September. So 30 days after the rent becomes due, if the tenant still hasn't paid, then you can seek to evict the tenant.